Okay, welcome everybody to the Destreza lecture series hosted by the Sacramento Sword School. My name is Puck Curtis and my guest host tonight is Tim Rivera. And our speaker tonight is Eric Myers. He's been a friend and colleague of mine for about 17 years now. And we came up through the Fencing Masters program together, studying under John Sullins, Ralph Somm, Janine Somm. And the process of training for 3 different examinations. We spent hours and hours together practicing fencing, the language of fencing, teaching fencing. We know each other really well at this point, and it allows us to work together at a level which is intuitive. It has a lot of depth. And it's partly because we have a shared system, which I think is one of the strengths of bringing everybody together to talk about Destreza as a system, to use the language together. He is a master at arms in classical Italian fencing. Certified by the San Jose State University Fencing Masters program in 2008. He teaches classical and historical fencing at the Sacramento Sword School and at the Sonoma State University Fencing Masters Certificate program. He's the co-founder of our school, Sacramento Sword School. He began fencing in 1984, which means he's probably about 22 years old, I think. And he's been researching historical European martial arts since 1997. Since 2005, his historical research is focused on the martial arts of Spain and Portugal. And in 2010, he co-authored with Steve Hick a monograph and translation of the 17th century Memorial of the Practice of the Montante by Diogo Gomes de Figueyredo, or Figgy, as we call him. Since then, he's continued his research and translation activities and has co-authored and collaborated on several books of Iberian fencing. And he's taught from these works and others at several large Western martial arts events in the United States and abroad. Well, by abroad, I mean Canada and Australia. And he's going to be talking about Montante, its place in Destreza as far as the system, and some of the nuts and bolts work on Figgy's memorial. And with that, I will get out of the way and let him talk.
Okay, let me get my presentation up here. All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, as Buck mentioned, I'm going to talk about Montante and its place in La Verdadera Destreza. Not monolithic, so I'm going to be focusing on one particular author here. I think Buck already basically covered this slide. Nothing else to add here, but keep going. Wanted to talk not just about my fencing background, but also language, because part of what I'm going to talk about is translation. So I partly grew up in Brazil, and after college, I returned there to work. So I have some junior high and high school, as well as some professional experience in Brazilian Portuguese, which is not quite the same thing as 17th century Portuguese. But it was close enough. And then also, fencing has language that's associated with it, right? So we think about maybe jargon with any system that you've studied, the names of guards or names of cuts or something like that. But actually putting the jargon into phrases that describe what's going on or analyze what's going on, that is language. That's not just terminology. And putting that spoken language and conceptual language into practice, the other side of that language, where you're speaking it with your body. So the habit of exercising our fencing language has carried over to our practice at the Sacramento Sword School. You could ask any of our students, and they will tell you how often we ask them questions to get them to use and practice using the terminology and the language to discuss what we're doing, in order to ask questions, in order to give answers. So let's move on. So what we're going to talk about today, the whole process that I went through with the translation and interpretation of Figueiredo's Montante work, and then how his work with Montante fits into Destreza, and how we use Montante in the classroom. So the work that I'm going to talk about is the Memorial da Prática de Montante, and it was a manuscript for the two-handed sword. It was never published. It's not long as far as manuscripts go, but it's quite long as far as two-handed sword material goes. It was written and dedicated to his patron, who was the Crown Prince, who then died. So if history had happened differently, we might have had a different tradition of two-handed sword. But he wrote it in 1651. He was a renowned general at the time, field marshal. I think he'd been field marshal, and now he was general. Maybe it was the other way around. And he was one of Portugal's national heroes, both as a man of letters, famous as a swordsman, a war hero, and at this point he's he's strongly in the middle of his career. He was also well known as a master of Destreza, and master might not be quite the right term here, in the sense he would never have been an examined fencing master, but he still uses the term master in some works. But he studied under another very famous master of Destreza, Gonçalo Barbosa. We don't have a lot of information about him, but he was possibly even more famous than Figueiredo was. So in 2005, Steve Hick found a transcription of the Memorial in a 1899 work from Portuguese aficionado of fencing, who had collected all the works that he could about fencing in Portugal and put them in a book. He found it and asked if anyone wanted help in translating it. And I was like, oh, pick me. But I don't think anyone actually, other than me, offered. I might have been just in the right place at the right time and suitably skilled to do it. Although that skill is somewhat questionable. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Like early on, there were a lot of translation challenges. Like I could read it, but I couldn't necessarily understand what was meant all the time. I had no experience with a great sword at that point. Some longsword, like I'd spent some time with Yori, and I guess that was probably about the extent of my longsword stuff. But the greatsword is clearly different. We actually had wooden wasters made that were oversized so that we would not accidentally use them like longswords. And then also very limited experience with Destreza terminology. Puck and Mary were out here already, and I was still learning the terminology, but there was a lot that I didn't know. Not much practice with it. We were still kind of trying to figure a lot of things out, and we were also just starting the fencing masters program, so we were kind of focused on classical Italian world at that point.
Just a question on this. I want to put some context together. What was the rough time period that you started this work?
2005.
So about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And then there was some other fencing terminology in the Memorial, and I wasn't really familiar with that. It didn't line up particularly well with other works that I knew. done some stuff with Bolognese, a fair amount of English and English-Italian material, some Italian. Just didn't really line up real well. So some, but there were a lot of questions. And then I couldn't really tell what was jargon or not. I mean, sometimes when you read something, you can say, oh, that's clearly a term that's meant or that means something. But you don't necessarily know whether that is specifically defined or whether it's just how you say it, because that's how you say it in the language, right? So like in a lot of fencing, we'll say take a step. But that's colloquial, right? That's not jargon. If you say take an advance, that's jargon. That's very specific. So sorting these out was a little bit of a challenge. And when I was starting, the Destreza connection was really not apparent. There were some reasons for that, not just the limited experience with Destreza. But no one thought it could be connected at the time. So, and then many differences from other historical systems. I covered that already. Then there's some other, just things that come up related to language. There's more Spanish influence. It's still definitely read like Portuguese, but there's some Spanish grammar on occasion or spelling. And it's not hard, but you have to make sure you're sorting it out. And then when you have a language that you're working from that's still separating to some degree from the other, they're still sort of mixed, then you have to start looking words up in old dictionaries in both languages, not just one. And there were plenty of times where I found that the Portuguese definition of a word didn't really line up, but the Spanish one totally did. So there's some choices to be made there when you're doing translation. Then there's some other just fun stuff, right? It's probably more fun if you're interested in the language, but you can go down rabbit holes like this. Mesoclisis is a holdover from when the future and conditional tenses were formed by a combination of the infinitive of the main verb followed by a form of haver, that's the verb to have. It's the present form in the future, imperfect in the conditional, and the clitic pronoun is placed between the stem and the ending. And if that sounded like a whole lot of information to you when you just heard it, that's what it was like to me too. And a lot of grammar is still that way. I've got to research it. But you're probably wondering what a clitic pronoun is now, right? That's a syntactically independent, but phonologically dependent pronoun. Am I about to catch the vapors? No.
So Lois is fanning herself over the grammar topic.
Okay.
Is there any famous Jedi Master who might use this kind of speech?
We'll get to that in a second. So in modern Portuguese, you wouldn't use this mesoclitic form. This particular verb, armar, is to prepare in this case. So you would say armará-se, but in 17th century, armar-se-á. If you're putting that "se," that's the pronoun, in the middle between the verb root and the conjugation. So if we look at these examples here, Portuguese, armar-se-á uma estocada sobre o braço direito. In English, just translated, you'll ready a thrust over the right arm. Makes sense. But if you add the mesoclisis into the English, you get the Yoda tense. You ready it will, a thrust over the right arm.
Why didn't you just do a literal translation? Literal.
Literal, got it. Yeah. So anyway, fun stuff like that. But it takes some time to dig into it, understand it, make sure you're doing the right thing. And now my friends from Brazil think that I'm really educated because I throw this into my written language when I'm. So it does pay off, right? Okay, right along here. Okay, so we had all these issues. How do we approach it? I tried to identify jargon and terminology. And then based on that, I looked for patterns. And when I found patterns, I tried to see if they helped me understand or identify concepts. So what are some examples of jargon? Well, polio, that's one, right? Or Tahoe in Spanish. So that was clearly something, right? It was a cut. It was close enough to like Tahoe and well, Talia in Italian, that I could understand. I knew it was a cut, and I knew that it was the forehand cut instead of the reverse cut. Still not sure that that was directly relevant here with the Montante, but you know, we're finding this out as we go through it. So we found patterns, right? There's a Talia with a step. There's a Talia without a step. There's a Talia without a step followed by another one with a step. So that's a little phrase, right? So maybe that's a concept. But still, so much of this was new that I kept having to learn a little bit so that I could translate it, so that I could learn some more, so that I could retranslate it, so that I could relearn it. And you know, here I've got a circular nature of translation, but you know, sometimes we talk about spirals, right? Not like the general techniques, but you know, a circle is just kind of spinning in one place, but a spiral moves forward. And so, you know, realistically, I could call this a spiral nature of translation. Iterative is another way we might look at it.
So you're saying that you circle back and revisit the concept with more information?
Yeah, yeah. And if you've ever been one to overthink things, this is your true nature. Like this is how you can bring this into a superpower. So anyway, as soon as something made enough sense that we could envision it, then we'd try it sword in hand, and then we'd come back to revisiting it. But there were some other just questions about translation, like how do we do this? One example is there's these two phrases, por diante and por detrás. And if you just look at them as the preposition por and then diante is in front and detrás is behind, you could come up with something that works, right? And so that would be positional, as I've got it here, right? So in front or through the space in front versus through the space behind. And we did look at this a little bit. I don't think it's the right direction, but you can work through all of the memorial using that as your understanding of it, and some people do. I think it's interesting that it works, but I think it's directional, and that means forwards and from behind. Por detrás means from behind in Portuguese or in European Portuguese. When I ask translators about this, if they're from Portugal, they're like, this means from behind. And if they're not from Portugal, they say, oh, I don't know, I think it means more like this, like I would never use it to mean that. And then I get a little lecture on tras, atrás, and detrás. And it's interesting, but I'm glad I asked people from Europe about it too, right? So I feel like there is something specific. There is a specific meaning that's closer to him, the author. So I'm going to go with that as what I think is my accurate translation. And so partly because it's directional rather than just positional, that lends me to think that it is more specific than general. What do I specifically mean by that? When we have a talio from behind, I think that is a specific path. It's not just any cut that comes from behind you. Okay, so another thing was how many turns are there? Because sometimes he talks about turns, and sometimes he talks or he lays out. I should have given some examples of what actually the verbiage is here, but he describes steps, and you just can't do the steps. Like there's no way to actually do the steps unless you turn. So he's got some that are explicit, some that are implied. There's other places you could turn, but it's not clear at all. What do you do? And then it's also another linguistic issue here. It's filled with a tornar, and tornar is the verb to turn. But guess what? It is not a turn here. It means in turn, not like the person at the front desk, right? But like I do something and then something else in turn. So sorting this out, just the language of it, was big. Like, my friends and where I worked, we never used actornar as a phrase, like just completely outside of my experience. So once I figured it out, then everything made a lot more sense. Here's a couple other translation questions we went through. Apequedo is read throughout the work. There's a lot of it. Literally, it is still or quiet-footed. So does that mean both feet are planted and you're doing something without a step? Or is it what everyone else in the world calls a firm-footed step, meaning a lunge? We tried both a lot, and I can't get it to be a firm-footed step in a way that I think is martially sound. Based on what follows afterwards, I think it's both feet just not stepping. And then we have this thing called postura recta. You ever heard of that? I had not, or I did not recognize it. So when we first released the translation, it was sword in upright position. That's perfectly clear Portuguese. But what I missed was that it's jargon, and it is right angle. How did I miss that? I'm not entirely sure. I think it took me too long to pick up on it. But I think I was also partly invested in the work that I'd already done and the path of the translation that I'd done. But once we realized it, we had to make sure that everyone else knew about it too. So 2.5 years after the initial release, it's a new version. There were a couple things that had changed in our understanding of the material. So upright position, nope, it's not the sword pointing upwards, it's right angle. We fixed that. And then what we had thought of as cloak guard, swinging the sword around like a cloak over something or someone. No, it was guarding a cloak on the ground. So by this time we found some other references, and I think Godini was one of them. It's like put your cloak on the ground, put your foot on it. So it was pretty sure. Pretty sure that that's what it was. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I seem to remember about the same time that there were people that were misreading the translation, and they were doing some things that were a little weird with some of the guards. So that you had also gone in to try to add some clarity to that. Do you remember what that was? Without naming any names.
There's still a lot of, so I tried to keep interpretation out of this, and my translators note, I specifically say that hopefully I've transmitted all the information that's in there and kept some of the puzzles. But there's a lot that's just not clear, and so it's been fascinating to watch people come up with their own approaches, their own interpretations. I think some of them are definitely wrong, but there's some that are out there that are interesting. I think the one that I come across the most is the people who want to use longsword, box, or fenestra, and I don't see it in here. It works, but I don't think that's part of it.
Do you have a slide later that talks about the set theory that you use for interpretation?
We're going to get to interpretation.
Okay.
But then we also had additional information about the author, and so we updated the introductory essay. Well, what we did not have yet was a lot more information about Montante lengths and weights around Europe. And so the one that we mentioned in our work is a little on the small side, a little on the light side. And we found that really two-handed swords are, unless they're a parade sword, they're pretty much the same all over. So when you release another version, there's this problem, which is that a lot of people don't pay attention to an update, right? They get it and they don't even think that there's going to be a new version. So if you are in any doubt about what you have or what you might be looking at, you could go get it at our official hosting, which is at oakshot.org. There's a link at Arms and Armor as well under the Montante trainer. In other sites, and there's a lot of copies of this all over the internet. If it says second edition on the title page and 2012 is the copyright date, that's the right version. That's the second version. I'm not planning a third, but we'll see. Okay. So we've talked about translation now, a little bit of interpretation, but let's focus a little bit more on the interpretation side of things. Remember, I said I had no great sword experience. Like, how do we know the right answer? How do we know when we've got it? There's no one to tell us. Not like a quiz where the teacher can say yes or almost, or you are way off base. So there's a lot of things that we used here. I would like to say that this next thing, the how does two-handedness affect causes compared to sword alone, was the main thing that we used. But we didn't really understand this until later. The main thing we used was trying things at something that we thought was full speed, and then we'd see if we could get up in the morning, the next day, without pain. And if we hurt, that wasn't right. And if we got up just fine, then that was possibly right. So, if you're young, That's a reasonable approach. Like, I wouldn't do that today. But it did give us a lot of information, right? We really learned a lot about the sword, and we developed a sense of the causes, even if we didn't have the language to really talk about them. But trying different things, trying them fast, slow, asking the questions that we could ask about them really helped. Okay, so let's go on to what I wish we had known then. How does two-handedness affect causes compared to sword alone? The increased leverage of two hands dramatically changes strength. Dramatically. There's a demonstration that we do when we teach this class where Puck will hold a single hand sword, and I'll put the Montante tip about a foot away from the strong of the sword and snap it and disarm him. So, like, how do you fight against that? It's hard. But there's all kinds of things on the other side when you're the Montante that, like, you don't have to worry about, as long as you're not facing another Montante in this case, right? But when you're facing a single sword or maybe multiple swords, there's all kinds of ways that leverage changes how things work. Short movements can be very quick and very powerful. Really, the Montante, all of the great swords, there's sort of a really interesting combination of a sword and a pole arm, and they have benefits from both. They are not all big and slow, but boy, can you do big movements with them. They are slower compared to smaller movements, but they're far more powerful. So we see recommendations of when do you use a Montante? In constrained spaces and against multiple opponents. And then there are implications for right angle also with this two-handedness. So I'm going to skip ahead, and then we're going to come back to this. So here's a comparison of, I guess, a mediocre right angle guard and how we would do right angle with the Montante in the lower picture. So I want everyone to try this. Stand up if you need to. You can do it sitting down too. And put your arm out like you're in right angle, nice and profiled. And now try to grip the pommel of the sword, of the Montante. You can't get there, right? You have to change a lot of your body. Profiling doesn't work like it used to. There's a lot of changes there. But that said, we use this this position for a number of things, right? It helps brace the Montante against your skeleton, gives you more control. You know, if you think of keeping your hands as the only parts of your body that are in contact with the grip of the Montante, then you have all these joints that come into play that can move and shift around. But when you lock it against part of your forearm, then it becomes a steadier extension. So there's a time to have your hands, or to have your pommel locked against your arm, and plenty of time to not do it also. But neither one of those is the right answer on their own. Okay, let's come back over here. So some things that are affected with this two-handedness: speed, time, and power. You can whip this thing around super fast because you have the two hands on it. Even some really big circular actions are fast, and they can be super powerful compared to a single hand sword. So how does time come into this? Well, if you are so much stronger all the way out to the tip of your sword compared to your opponent with a single hand sword, then they're going to stay further away, and you have more time in which to do things. Alternatively, if you're controlling their sword, control it from further away, but you have more time to act. So playing with these variables is something we spend a fair amount of time doing. Like, you can't actually hit someone safely with a Montante. So you have to have a friend like hold the sword and either run away or try to parry or something. It gets dicey if you bring other people into it. So you have to practice a lot of this on your own, have a good idea of what speed, time, and power is from a single hand sword that you might be facing. Or in the case of multiple opponents, then you also have to deal with turning around and being surrounded. Then there's big versus small movements, right? Sometimes big movements are important, sometimes not so much. Sometimes bigger is easier in controlling a fast, small movement. But when you have your two hands on the Montante separated like that, small movements are easy, and big is not always easy. Let me on our next thing here. Okay, so stepping was another thing that we played around with a lot. And is one of the things that probably brought me more towards the Destreza, towards accepting the Destreza concept, strangely enough. I mean, Destreza concept for the Montante. So one of the problems that we found early on in our experiments of trying stuff at speed and seeing if we could get up the next day was rotational inertia on the spine. And we found that that is not a good thing. Some of you may know that from other experience. But it just keeps you turning, and then you're putting your energy and your muscles into controlling this thing that is not moving in a way that your skeleton can really deal with.
Can I just get you to comment on this a little bit? Because I think one of the things that we found is that much metal moving through space quickly is really difficult to stop. And like the act of forcing a stop in a weapon like that, part of that is why you hurt the next day, because you're stopping it elegantly. Would you agree with that, and could you add to that?
Yeah. So we tried some other things too, right? Not just like stepping offline with cuts, but if you look at how a lot of people work with longsword, they be like with feet on rails, right? Like one ahead of the other, but still separated. They're a little bit more square, and that just kept the same rotational we had. But stepping straight along a line fixed it all. Everything that you're going to do to stop, either in front of you at the end of your skeletal chain, or behind you at the end of your skeletal chain. So it seemed odd to us, right? It's like, shouldn't we be using this historical footwork that everyone else wants to use? And the answer was not really. It's not like there's a single line that you go back and forth on, but the way that the memorial describes combat against multiple opponents is often one opponent at a time, right? You address one, you turn around, you address another. Turn around, you address another. And those turns don't have to be 180 degrees, but they're enough to get you facing your opponent, and then you step straight towards them, right? You have this thing with all this power in your hands that any reasonable swordsman should be terrified of. You can step straight towards them. So this linear stepping just made everything work, and in a lot of ways, I think it makes the Montante even more terrifying. You don't have to do any of the sidestepping or moving along a circle. Did that answer what you wanted, Puck? Or was there something else you were thinking of?
Yeah, I think that's it. I like the key things that like were hurting us was trying to stop the Montante in space, like you would a longsword, and then locking the blade, locking the hilt to your skeleton, or using the extension of the skeleton as a cushion for stops.
Then I mentioned turning before, right? There's explicitly mentioned turns, there's implied turns, and then there's possible turns. And most of the implied ones, you learn to recognize them pretty quickly, and they're like just short of explicit. It's way more than a suggestion. It doesn't actually say turn. It's just that he starts giving you a description of what to do that you have to have been turned around. And then possible is ones where we looked at, right? It's like if you're surrounded, you're in a rule like for fighting multiple opponents. If you're doing like 3 or 4 things, that's at the very edge of what you can safely do before you have to really worry about the person behind you. So you should be looking for a chance to turn around. So if you see a sequence of 6 or 7 actions and you haven't turned around, but you know that it's against multiple opponents, you missed a turn. And and we found that that they work, right? So you learn a little bit about turns there, but from a translation perspective, I didn't want to put too much in there, right? So I still kept the explicit ones in there. I didn't make the implied ones explicit. I just put a note: look for turns, look for opportunity. Okay, another interpretation experiment. Do taglio and revés, default directions in Montante, just like they do with sword alone? Don't really have an answer to this yet, but I think it's the wrong question. So we can look at other systems that use great swords, and they have a lot of rising cuts. Montante is actually from rising cuts. Monty tells us that it's from the Levante series of 2 or 3 rising cuts is the introduction to the handed sword. So is there a default direction for cuts in Destreza? I'm going to say no. We cut based on the cause, right? So we have some cases where we strongly favor a certain type of cut, a certain path. Right, so when we're in an executive movement, then we want a cut that has a natural part of its movement. But it's not universal, right? If you have a Tahoe and you cut to face, that is a rising cut. So default, wrong question. Question is, what are you doing with the sword? And we can see, right, where he has actions that are dispositive they might be rising. They often are rising. But when it's executive and it's a power cut, yeah, it's definitely descending in nature, just like we would expect from Destreza. So this gets us starting to look at Destreza as a system and how this might fit into it, right? We start seeing the links between the Montante and Sword.
Just for people that aren't aware of the natural power argument in Destreza, could you restate that? This is the Carranza thing initially.
Sure. So we have, and I'm going to kind of go with Figueiredo's take on this. He says that there are two basic directions, two basic paths that we need to think about in Destreza, and that is natural and violent. Natural is descending and violent is rising. So if you just put two swords sticking out and one is on top, resting on top of the other, they're going to have an easier time, right? They don't have to hold their sword up, whereas the other person has to hold their sword up. If that's the exhibit. So when we attack or when we cut with the natural path of gravity in our favor, that's good. Gives us strength. Don't have to fight it. Figueiredo goes a little bit further than this. He says that I remember this. I think I'm gonna have to look this up. Sorry, one of them is slow to start and fast to end, and the other is the opposite. But anyway, so once you're starting to see some connections that show some consistency with Destreza, then we really have to ask what other ties are there? What other ties to Destreza do we see? So, now looking on it, it's a little embarrassing to have missed that whole right angle thing in the very first rule. But, we make mistakes, we learn from them. But the author has this Destreza background, right? He's famous in his day as being an adherent and a follower of Destreza. So someone who is this vehement about the system that they use, it's not going to switch system when they switch weapons. They're still going to use the philosophy and the theory, understanding of causes. There's just no way that an author with a Destreza background is going to step out of it for this weapon. When I fence classical Italian foil, it's different, right? I'm specifically trying to operate in a different system, not just because of the weapon. Okay. So then another thing here we see is his advice on Montante versus Montante. He has a rule about that, and you can read it here if you want. But I've highlighted or bolded the key things here that I want to call out. He says, based upon those of the sword, you can know the qualities of those for the Montante, their weakness or their strength, with the single difference that all the deflections, parries, and attacks of the Montante must be helped by the movements of the body. Right? So he says, based on what you already know, you'll know this, but use your body. And this generalization will suffice for those who have the knowledge of the true skill of the sword, which is the foundation of all the arms that have been invented. So what he's saying is, when the causes are equal, We've already studied that. Use your Destreza, just like you would a single sword. There's going to be some changes, right? Because we talked about profile and whatnot, but these are like minor, right? He wants you to directly bring all of your experience from single hand sword to here. And then at the end, here's another tie. So remember, Carranza complains about rule-based learning with Montante. And so Figueiredo talks about that. He gives advice on how to learn from the rules, not to use them like rules. It's directly addressing Carranza's criticism. So again, I've just bolded one section here. The admonition that no swordsman necessarily should do this or that rule, but rather should take from them all which they best understand and that serves to defeat their adversary.
Let me just make a comment here.
Yeah.
Like, you and I have done a lot of this work together, and one of the things I find is that I can do the rules, but I've done them enough that I also have sort of a strange sense memory where if I want to pull something out, it may be some of this, it may be some of that. It all just sort of blends together. I think that comes from reps, just doing it over and over.
Yeah, definitely. We see developing. Well, let me just go back to what. I click on this. Okay. So he says that practicing these will cultivate an agility equal to a natural one. So that's interesting, right? He's like, you don't have to be naturally good at this. You can learn to be good at this. One who is well exercised in the rules, just be able to pull out whatever they need, linking one rule to another. Then neither haste will confuse the memory, or lack of vigor reduce the activity, which warn them. And that is really what we see, right? We learn little phrases, like we don't really learn the whole rules. I mean, but what really sinks in as muscle memory in a way is smaller phrases, right? And we get a sense of where the sword is in space and where it's going, and that can flow into a different set of movements. We'll cover this a little bit more when we get to Montante in the classroom also. Okay, so then there's some other just Destreza consistent elements. In the memorial, we control the opponent's blade before stepping forward. So we have things like a talia from behind while standing still, and another putting forward the right foot. And we have rebases the same way. So we compare it to some other authors, like Eugenius one, who often steps with the first cut. Right? I think that's sort of anathema to a lot of Destreza masters. And then we have turns that lead with a thrust, or sideways before you step into that space, or over the shoulder before you step into that space. So it's similar, right? We're controlling space, we're presenting a threat, we have the option to stop if we need, but we're not just stepping in. And then, like I mentioned before, most clearly executive movements are descending. So when it's an attack, when it's the final movement of an attack, it's pretty much always descending. So mixed, natural, and aligning, same as for sword alone. Whereas you look at other works, the great sword, and that's not true. Like there's all kinds of other cuts that are meant as final attacks. And then Montante versus Montante. Causes are equal. then you use your Destreza footwork. No passing steps in distance. Right foot leads all advances. And he says this about the single sword too, right? So like in our school, we pass with the left foot regularly, but Figueiredo would absolutely disagree with that. So he's in his single sword Destreza and in his okay, so what is Destreza, right? I mean, this sounds like a huge topic, and it certainly could be, but I just want to pull a couple threads here, right? Because using the Montante so much has really influenced how I conceive of Destreza and what I think is important about it. And maybe not strangely, Figueiredo has the same approach. So Destreza is technique derived from theory or philosophy. The theory is really good, but not everyone derives the same technique from it. So there's this danger of sticking too much to the letter of the text and not the spirit of the text. Right? If I can sort of misquote something. That means sticking to technique at the expense of theory. That sort of thing is common for beginners. Like we've all been there. We've all done that. But we see it exists in the historical record too, where people describe the technique as the thing, but it's not the expression of the thing. So theory and technique must adapt to address a situation, right? I mean, this is fencing, right? We have to adapt all the time. We have to be flexible. If we're rigid all the time, we're bad. So how do we do that? Well, understanding other weapons improves your understanding of your theory and your technique and how it can flex and when it should flex. So we use Montante and dagger, not Montante and dagger together, obviously, but Montante plus sword and dagger in other cases. It helps students learn a broader range of causes and how they can be addressed by theory and technique. So like you've heard some other examples how we approach things in the school, like Caden talked a couple weeks ago about shifting the measure de proportion based on your opponent. That's exactly what we do. We keep the same definition, but we change the measurement according to the cause. We have this great theory of what does it mean to be in medio de proportion, not how far away is it. How far away is an ideal that's described in the books, but it's something that has to shift, has to adjust. Okay, so in the classroom, every year we have a Montante section. And it's usually about 2 months long total for all this. Isn't that right, Doug?
Say again?
Our Montante section is typically about 2 months, isn't it?
Yeah, a month to 2 months.
So initially, at the beginning of it, we just practice rules right out of the text, according to student level, focus on general biomechanics. It's a lot of fun. It's a little nerve-wracking if there's too many people in a small room, but there's ways to make that work. It's really good for students who are kind of new, not brand new, but kind of new, to try a totally different thing that's still in your system. So had students who, their knees and elbows are kind of under control with a single sword, and we give them a Montante, and they're all funny about it. But they get there, right? And so they're developing an agility like a natural one, and they do get there. With the more advanced students, they start off smooth, fast, modifying the rules on their own. And with the more advanced students, we've given them homework. Create a new rule of your own. Name it and teach it to your fellow students. That's been really fun to see. Sometimes people make up a rule, and it turns out it's already an existing rule. So that's really cool, right? It's not that they copied it. They came up with a situation. They came up with a way to address it. And just because someone else did also doesn't make it wrong, right? It's great. They're in the system. They've come up with something like that. Okay. Cutting with a Montante to inform cutting with single hand sword. This is mostly to do with like hanging parries and cutting in a circle, right? So dropping, tip, and cutting around, right? With two hands, cutting around this way. But it helps a lot of students kind of get a sense of what the path of that circular cut should be, right? It's harder to fight a Montante than it is to fight a single hand sword. So the Montante is going to go somewhere, and you follow that, and then once you have that in your muscle memory, then you can do that with a single hand sword as well. Then we practice some actions against single hand swords. Again, this isn't fencing, but it's so people get a sense of the changes in leverage with the two-handed sword. Possibly the most fun one of these is separating two people who are fencing or who are fighting. That's always a great one to end class on in a seminar as well. It's amazing. I mean, you can almost disarm people just with those actions. And then sometimes we've done actions against multiple swords. This is a harder one because you have to be careful of people. They're turning around. It doesn't work real well in a small room. But if you have people who can at least hold up swords, then the person who is wielding the Montante can get a sense of what it's like to encounter other swords, multiple other single-hand swords. Maybe how much time they have to complete these turns as well. And then the other thing we do is we take inspiration from the Montante and we practice some of those rules as partner drills for single-hand sword. Those are a lot of fun. Any of the Montante rules you can do single-hand sword. Sometimes when I've taught, I've used single-hand sword so I can hold my printout in the other hand. Works great. But it's if you're teaching, it's still good to let your students use the two hands on the weapon. But it works. You can do it single-handed. And in class, all of those rules, you just make up what the partner does, right? And have your students use the rules as they are. Okay, I think that's all I've got on that. Right. So, are there any questions?
All right. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and Tim and I will pull them out for Eric. While we were working through this, I sort of had I remembered one of the things that we had pulled out of this, and I was wondering if you could comment on it. But we had been looking at the way the Montante used sort of a ripping play, that flowing, dynamic play. And if you think about Destreza play as composed as opposed to ripping, and you look at somebody like Ton fencing, we sort of use some of the Montante concepts to get into that style, that more dynamic fighting style. Can you talk about that connection a little bit?
Sure. So, most famously, the Montante is used against multiple opponents, and there's a lot of turning all the way around, multiple turns, sweeping, blades or hands or arms away. There's a lot of descriptions from the period that talk about a Montante fight and just the littered limbs on the ground. So there's some literal ripping right there. But it's interesting also to see that a lot of the shorter phrases in the rules are a single. They're really oriented towards a single opponent, right? They're not geared towards fending off a lot of opponents at once. And these often have, something like a beat, and then you enter, or they have something that you could look at as a feint. That's a thrust followed by a cut. So we see that plenty in Destreza, right? And then when we get into pole arms, right? What's longer than a Montante? A pole arm, totally longer than a Montante. So we don't just rush in. We use something an awful lot like the accompagnamento imperfecto. Right, there's a sweeping aside of the blade, taking a couple steps, leading a cut, followed by a duck under the parry, thrust, another cut. So it's this sort of can opener sort of sequence that works really nice. But it's it's totally several feints as you come in. Is that the example that you were thinking of? But
Yeah, I think so. Like just some of the Montante play informed how we revised some of the Destreza work we were doing.
So Eric, how much did you find that your interpretations or playing around with early translations of Figueiredo's rules influence your actual translation?
How did playing around with them sword in hand affect the translation?
Yeah, because like you said, it was essentially the first Montante source that had been translated or was being translated, and you didn't have that. Opla Sophia wasn't out yet. Godinho wasn't readily available yet, so you didn't have a lot of context to put that in. So I was wondering how much actually trying to interpret your own reading of it changed the way that you thought it should be interpreted or translated.
So in the beginning of it, there was definitely a bunch of that, trying things and just looking at it and being like, that can't be what he's saying there. I think the next thing that really came into play was figuring out what the phrases are. So that tells you where to put in commas or periods, right? And that was big. That happened a lot. Just this list of actions that you do, and it's not always clear.
Yeah.
So I tried to add clarity by use of grammar and some word choices. And And then the other thing I think that comes into play is I hate the idea of releasing something that's just wrong just because I rushed through it. And so working through it helped me, I guess, believe in my final translation, right? I mean, there were still mistakes, and it's not like I feel like I'm the only one with the right answers to these or anything. There's still questions that I have. There's things that I think that we're never really going to know the answer. Right? We're always going to have to. There are a couple right answers. But having the confidence in the translation, I think, came from developing the familiarity with it, sword in hand.
I lost you guys for a little bit there. I don't know if it's going to affect the recording or not. Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Do we have more questions? So Eric, we have a question about whether you found mentions of Montante being the sword of the fencing master or the referee, specifically in the context of fencing duels and competitions.
Yeah, there's a lot of references to that. The Montante was the sort of the badge of the fencing masters time period that we're looking at, maybe a little earlier. So like literally a badge, like they would wear it on their chest. But also it was a tool used to help manage the classroom. The Montante and also a teaching staff, which is the same length as Montante, both used to break up fights, if we believe the memorial. So yes.
What was the line about
let me add something to that. Actually, hang on just a second. In Figueiredo's other work, he actually talks about the staff used for bouts, and I think he's referencing like public exhibition bouts at this point. And there's all kinds of moves of how you knock down or up, or turn either end. This master staff. Okay, what did you have?
There was a citation about visiting instructors in the Montante, and I don't remember the provenance of it or exactly how it went.
Of visiting instructors?
Yeah, if another instructor visits your school, they should be given.
Yeah, I don't remember where that came from, but they should they should be given a Montante as a sign of I guess like respect, and so that people know who they are, of their role.
Yeah, I don't remember the source, but I remember it was Jaime Girona that found that, pulled out part of it.
Mm-hmm. Did John just call that his boomstick?
I think based on that, we shouldn't let the students actually have the Montantes in class. It should only be you and me. They're going to have to earn it.
That's right. Yeah.
It seems like there's a question that we typically ask, and I don't remember what that question is.
I'm sure if you think hard enough, you can remember.
Have to do with drinking?
Well, we have to say something about Pacheco because his name hasn't come up yet. What do you think Pacheco would think of the Montante?
Good question. I don't know. I think he would probably complain about Montante users, but not the Montante itself.
So sort of like hate the style, not the stylist.
Or the other way. Yeah. Yeah, but he didn't do it. It's just funny to me. Like there's so many of the authors who just don't talk about it, right? And like the ones that do complain about the ones that don't. Maybe they're elitist snobs, but say that I kind of like the position about complaining about people who don't include multiple weapons in their curriculum.
So Andrew, you typed a question in. Can you type it in again? I lost connectivity for a little while, so I may not have it.
I've got it.
Okay, go ahead.
He's asking about Rule 2, both simple and composed. And he wants to know about your interpretation about whether the cuts are ascending or descending and how Rule 2 simple is distinct from Rule 1 simple.
Rule 2 cuts are descending. They are distinct from 1, which is ascending. So Andrew asked me about something similar related to this rule before. This is the first set of rules where we see people using aux or fenestra as a starting point. And I think that the verbiage for the rule arguably supports that. I'm not quite convinced of it, but to be honest, I use it sometimes. I tend to start more like in somewhere between right angle, but a little bit more mixed angle than that. So more like Codalunga or Porta de Ferro. That mixed angle is the same thing that Figueiredo recommends for single sword, but it works, right? So it doesn't have to be low, right? But like if we just look at Codalunga and Portaferro in another system, they have a high version as well. So I think that the high version of those makes a fair amount of sense, and everything flows just fine from that, just as well as it would from aux or finesse.
So there was a follow-up question to that. There was some interest in hearing how you go from translation to interpretation.
Maybe we can get some more clarification on kind of what the question is about. It's like how you get started doing interpretation on your translation, or like why was I even trying interpretation in the first place? Rule 2 is an example. Yeah, it is. It is challenging on both counts. So, there's this other voice when you're doing translation work, and that voice is the editor. And sometimes you get to do editing, and sometimes you don't on what you're translating. So if you can make something clearer, that's fine, right? but you can't like add things that aren't there. So it's not my translator hat that I actually wear here. It's my science background hat. That's because in science, if you're not comfortable with questions and not knowing things, you're probably in the wrong field, right? I mean, there's a lot that we know, but there's an awful lot that we don't. And so you have to try things, and that's how you learn what's out there, right? So the scientific method mostly starts with observation, right? I mean, you look at old science, and it's based on observation and drawing conclusions from patterns that you see. And that's the same thing, right? I mean, sometimes you look at the words that are written down, and you just can't make them any clearer. Then you're done translating, and you're going into interpretation. And that was the case with two. The rules, too simple and too complex, or too confound. There's not a whole lot more work to be done on the translation. You have to try it, and trying it, like even with the different interpretations that I have, like I can't go back and make the translation any different.
Can I chime in on that?
Sure.
So not necessarily specifically about two, but one of the things that you had expressed to me when we were doing a lot of this early work, because we tried a lot of different things, you had created a guiding principle based on like a set theory, and we would try things, and in order to, we can't prove that something's correct, like you had stated, but we could create a set of possible solutions.
Right.
Where in order to get into that set, you had to be martially sound, you had to be the best, like the best guess that we had on interpreting the rule. And then for a rule, there could be multiple correct answers in the set. And the more that we worked on this, the more we began to see that as a feature rather than a restriction.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have someone that says they want to see what goes on in your head going from words to actions. I can tell you, having watched it, every now and then he hits himself in the head doing it.
Yeah, that's happened.
It's hilarious. We have a statement like, if you're not hitting yourself in the head with the Montante, are you really trying?
Okay, is that it for questions?
So tell me about this acometamiento I've been hearing about.
That's it.
That was it. We covered it pretty well last week. Is there anything left to say?
I've got a question based on what you know of Figueiredo, Destreza, and Montante. Are you starting up do you have another PowerPoint on acometamiento?
I do, yep.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll save that.
I'm trying to get the right one up here. See it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Okay. So last week, Puck talked about accometimiento, and there's really nothing I would disagree with that. I think he talked very usefully and comprehensively about what it is. So what I wanted to talk about specifically is accometimiento things. This is a thing that comes up a lot. And if you've got to leave now, they're the same thing. Not always the same thing, but basically they're the same thing. What I realized was that what I kept hearing was that people said, oh, they're not feints. Oh, they're not feints. But then they would describe a feint. And so eventually I realized that the problem isn't that people don't know what accometimiento is, it's that they don't know what a feint is. But this discussion is really good, but I'm going to be a little snarky in some of these, and I don't mean that negatively at all. The discussion of what goes into this is very interesting, and it made me look into feints a lot more, right? So my feinting background is Italian, classical Italian, and other classical and sport fencing, and soccer, or football, depending on which. But it still seemed like maybe it was a little too specific in how it was defined. So I spent a lot of time collecting comments about accometimiento and feints. And in our time period that we're mostly looking at, they're the same thing. So that's the 17th century. Destreza and Italian authors are discussing the same thing. They're talking about them the same way. They're looking at them the same way. Now, not all accometimientos or feints are created equal. I don't want to base definition on something done badly. This is another thing that comes up. We'll sometimes describe like a horrible feint that like no one who thinks that feints are a good thing would ever consider that a good thing. But that doesn't disqualify feints, right? Something that's done badly, like we don't want to use that as the definition, right? Well, it can help us understand them, but not fine. And then there's outliers, and I don't think they're going to negate a definition here. They're just kind of oddballs. Remember what I said before about having multiple right answers? Okay, so my assertion here is that 17th century Destreza and Italian authors use similar language to describe accometimientos and feints and broadly discuss this language. And the differences between them are in implementation or technique, not in theory. So also from our previous topic on the Montante, remember we talked about theory and technique. So I think sometimes we talk about whether we talk about a technique, but I'm talking about theory, right? I think that any accometimiento would be called a feint by the Italians based on technique. I also believe that's true based on theory. The other way around, I'm not quite as sure about. I think that feints in theory are exactly the same as accometimiento, but Destreza authors would look pretty askance at some of the Italian. So here are some comments from 17th century authors. We'll start with Pacheco, who says, feints, which are the same thing as accometimientos. So it's hard to argue with that, right? Does it? Everyone else has to test, and in his system, and so everyone else thinks that they're the same also. That's kind of snarky, but that's the foundation, right? I don't think there's a lot of question about it. So in Destreza, here's something that would say: the acometimiento to the face is not perfect because it does not have aspects proportionate enough to cause fear. And the Italians say that it must be perceived as a real attack. Some authors phrase it as it should not be recognized as a thing. So, talking about the same thing here. In Destreza, after the Diestra was made as Tahoe and has chosen the distance to reach his opponent, he will take the disposition to wound. Right? So, choosing his distance so that he can wound, that means that he can wound. Italians say it must be done from a distance one can actually hit from. Kind of goes back to the first point, right? It helps support it, right? You're not going to believe it's a real attack if you can't actually be hit by it. And the last one here, the acometimiento perfecto, is a threat with the virtue to wound or make the opponent change position. Italians say the opponent must be hit in the original line if they don't parry, but normally the final attack finishes in a different line if the opponent parries. So if you try to get more specific than this, then you should be having this talk like over a drink in a pub or something. But if you can think of acometimiento and feint from the 17th century as still something that's fairly loose, right? It's a threat which draws a reaction so that you can hit in time. And if they don't react, you hit them anyway. Like, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, all the discussion about the mechanics of it and everything like that's totally fascinating. It's great to do. But I want to actually do something I wasn't going to say.
We have a clarifying question. Can we go back to the other slide?
Yep.
So the statement is the acometimiento to the face is not perfect. And
right.
Somebody says, maybe I'm not understanding this because I think there's a problem with using the term perfect as in perfect imperfect, or is he saying that it is not of good quality in that statement? Can you give us some clarity on that?
So he's naming a technique, right? So the acometimiento to the face is not the acometimiento perfecto to the face. So in perfect here, I think he's discussing quality. In the same way that he uses perfect and imperfect, which is the same way he would use perfect and imperfect in the two that he ends up approving of.
Okay.
So I wanted to step out of the 17th century briefly just to show that we start to see some different discussion once we get to the 18th century. So Rada says that acometimiento is a limited act without a final resolution of its own. He calls it a threat without execution. And the term that he uses, amago, is that's not the threat of something that's like barreling towards your face. That's like the I'm gonna, right? It's that kind of threat. And so he's starting to call this out as something that is its own thing that isn't quite as tightly connected to what follows. I mean, it is connected to what follows, but but a lot of the discussions that we have in our more 17th century perspective is it converted? Is it smooth? Like, how do you tell? which is the one you're expecting to happen? How do you account for the observation point or something? But they don't talk about it that way. But here we see Rada starting to talk about it this way. And eventually, this is the discussion that happens. And we end up with definitions that sound like where Rada's going. And then we have the Academia Autoridades, that's the dictionary, Spanish language, 1726. And they're trying to talk about this a little bit differently also. So it's kind of the beginning of a new discussion of things. It seems like we don't see this as much in the 17th century. So if you say that acometimiento isn't the same as a 20th century feint, yeah, I could probably agree with that. But 17th century, it's the same thing. What do you call them? Well, I wouldn't ever tell someone to not say it in Spanish. That's fine. We're studying Spanish art. But if you can't say acometimiento smoothly, you just save a syllable and say it in Portuguese, acometimento. Or you can save 6 syllables and just say feint. It's the same thing. Okay. Snark aside. I really do think that Destreza should read the Italian discussion of feints. I'm talking about the 17th century times. It is more comprehensive. It's a better discussion. And there's a lot more material available in English. So if you're listening to this talk, probably more comfortable in English, it's worth it. A lot of the Italian works have a little chapter, a couple paragraphs on feints. Read it. That's exactly what the Destreza authors are thinking. It's just better written. But I don't want you to become Italian, right? But if you understand how the Italians talk about it, then you'll see that the technique in Destreza, or the acometimientos, is the safest subset of technique. When I fence Italian, I use acometimiento, definitely. It's the safest ones. But you look at the perfecto, it's from a Tahoe, it's feint by glide to the face, close enough to hit, that's as good as it gets. Everything that could make your situation work better for you is in that technique. So, use your Destreza with a fuller understanding. Keep talking about acometimiento, how you do it, why you do it, that sort of thing. But don't say it's not a feint, because it's totally a feint. Okay, I think that's all I got there. Yep. Any questions?
Tim had a question. We have a question from Tim Rivera.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, thanks, Puck. Very Peach. So my question's about teaching the Montante and rules. So, you've stated that Figueiredo's Montante is very much connected to his verdadera Destreza. Just different causes because it's not one Montante against another.
Right.
So I wouldn't ask you to try and get into Figueiredo's mind and say why he taught them in rules. Just in your opinion, and from what you know of it, do you think that that is a good way or the most efficient way, or would you go about it a different way?
So I think that's a really good question. And you may have heard Tone talk about this. Tone and I have talked about it. There's a couple things going on. Like, one is that the Montante is older than Destreza. So if there weren't as many people teaching it, or there weren't as many people learning it, it makes a certain amount of sense to import some of the pedagogy that accompanied it. The biggest problem with not using rules of the Montante is that you can't safely hit anyone with it. You can't fence, right? So it sort of has to be a solo form for a while until you get good at the movements, right? Until you've developed that agility like a natural one. I think at that point, with some more advanced partners, you could do some other stuff perhaps. So it makes sense there, right? I think that I don't want to just dismiss Carranza's complaint about the fencing masters. It was obviously based on something, but it's a little hard to imagine, good martial artists not teaching with rules the same way that Figueiredo described. So I don't think that he is the one in his lineage who first linked the the rules to how to use them in this way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So on the other side of that, one of the things that's interesting is that teaching a series of rules, it doesn't give you a system. It gives you sort of the echo of a system. But if Figueiredo is like specifically linking to Destreza, then you have access to the system as well. So you have tempo theory and you have the medio theory all rolled in, where teaching somebody the rules like some of the early Montante texts, it doesn't have any of that, not even implied.
I think that's true, but you look at the other Montante texts, and there are things like two talios, a thrust, and a revés. Like that doesn't tell you anything about the system, right? But you can still imagine them fitting into a system. So a lot of the early ones are sort of, I don't know, just like a reminder of what to do. The rules in Figueiredo are most closely are closest in terms of similarity to Barbaran or the Zaragoza manuscript. The first handful of rules are largely the same, and that's older, right? And so there's something that's there, and it's not as detailed as Figueiredo is, but the shorthand lines up with his more detailed rules. So I think it's really interesting to look at what we see out in the Hemaverse today, right? There's people who want to learn a weapon. That's what they're for. So a lot of people out there studying Montante, but that's just because it's the weapon they like. They're not really studying all the rest of a system around it. And I think that, like with Figueiredo's, we clearly have Destreza as a connection, and with others we don't. Right? So maybe it's okay. Maybe they can tie it to their other system, but I don't really see them doing it.
Do we have another question? A couple of questions coming from the audience. Do you have any sources that you think are good for providing fundamental or foundational instruction that would inform Montante? So like stances, mechanics, etc.
Well, let's look at it from the system perspective, right? I mean, for those of us that are here, we have 200 years of Destreza texts. So I would start there. I think it's interesting to read Godinho, what he does, and it's really nice that he explains what he does and why he does it in a lot of cases. But his movement palette is definitely different than Figueiredo. So if you look at Bolognese, like there's a lot of really nice illustrations from Marozzo. It might help a little bit. Alfieri, his illustrations are pants, but his descriptions kind of line up to kind of give you a nice sense. But really, I think that I would go with what Figueiredo says, right? Use what you know from Destreza. Support everything you do with the Montante with the whole body, and go practice it.
So, in your opinion, what's the relationship between Montante and Common School Destreza?
It was certainly more common in the Common School than it ever was in Destreza. By the time Figueiredo writes, it's towards the end of Montante as a weapon. I mean, he certainly, if he didn't use it himself, he certainly like ordered other people to use it in combat and in war. But it was towards the end of its lifetime, so it had been more popular in the previous century. Yeah, I want to talk about what Caden said here too. Chat, and I see that. I think it's really important for people to try other things, study a little bit of other systems to get a sense of them. You don't have to be great at them, but you should at least practice some of them enough so that you can sort of do them, so that you can think either with your body or your mind in that system. In the same way that we use Montante or Sword and Dagger to help students understand variations and causes that we look at in our Destreza system, you can look at others as contrast also. And any other, really. Sword, basis for the single sword. That's probably a better question for Tim. But we see that in a lot of the medieval period, where two-handed swords are common, and we're using passing steps. You can do them with a single sword or two-handed sword. But the two-handed sword is the one that teaches the movement that better. You just do the same thing with a single-handed sword. Tim, do you have a sense of that?
I think our understanding of the Common School is limited enough that that's hard to really say. I mean, with Dino, it seems like the sword is foundational as opposed to the Montante. You've got other authors, I think Roman and also De La Torre both talk about how the sword alone is the queen, and with that you can understand any weapon, you can defend against any weapon, and that also gets echoed in I think Pacheco says the same thing essentially. So I don't know. I think it's our sources on the common Destreza are fragmentary enough that it's hard to draw some kind of generalization.
Right.
All right, we're 20 minutes past, so want to put out a call for questions one more time, and then we can wrap it up.
Yeah, actually, I think people should read the Monty section on Montante. That informed a lot of our understanding of it.
I have a Destreza joke that only this crowd would get. There was an artist who was drawing a lot of grappling. People said he was busy drawing conclusions. Hey, if you get the joke, you can use it at your own school. It's not like it's copyrighted.
Also, don't feel that you're required to use that joke.
Okay, so thank you, Eric, for talking about that. I think I'd like talking about the translation process and revising translations and a little bit of the history of like this art that we study and the work that goes into it. I think it was really interesting. I certainly got a lot out of it. And I was there, so thanks for putting it all together.
Yeah,
Next week, we're going to have Daniel Hombreus from Europe, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about putting together media for Destreza. So he creates YouTube videos based on RADA. So we're going to have another RADA guy, another European. Everybody cross your fingers for that internet connection, and let's see how it goes. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.